All right, well, welcome Spencer Christian Church to another installment of our study in the Gospel of Mark. And just as a quick reminder and a way to ramp into our study for today, I'd like for us to remember kind of where we have been. And remember, as we study through the book of Mark, we're trying to ask the question over and over again, in a limited amount of scroll space that Mark had in recording the Gospel of Jesus. Why did he select and choose the things that he selected to record? He didn't have a terabyte hard drive where he could write pretty much anything that he wanted to. He had a limited amount of space. So coming off of something that I think is being established as a bit of a theme, is the healing or the casting out of this demon from the boy that caused the boy to be deaf and mute. So Jesus performed countless miracles in all different sorts of maladies and illnesses and ailments. Yet what Mark seems to be focusing in on quite a bit is the healing of people that are deaf and are blind. And so that's interesting. We talked about this a little bit in the last installment of our study. But we talked about this Old Testament language of eyes to see and ears to hear in passages like Isaiah 6 and 6:10 and Jeremiah 5:21 and Ezekiel 12:2. And what we talked about, coming off of the heels of that two-stage healing where Jesus spits into his hand and he partially heals the blind man, and he says, how do you see things? And he said, well, they're kind of fuzzy and upside down. And when we look at that language that are in the passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel with this eyes to see and ears to hear language, and it's covenant language, it's kingdom language, it's also oftentimes couched in rebellion against the covenant and against God. And he says, you just don't have eyes to see, you don't have ears to hear. So I think what Mark is doing through really focusing in on these types of miracles that Jesus did is that the people aren't having eyes to see and aren't having ears to hear. So as we further ramp into our study for today, let's look at a couple of verses that we looked at last week. It says, when Jesus saw the crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again. After crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out, and the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. So we have that deaf-mute situation, another account of a deaf or mute or blind person being healed. And now we have this resurrection type language. He was like a corpse, and Jesus raised him up. You see where we're going with that? I think Mark is literally giving us some hints upon the path, because we're only like 2 chapters away from the triumphal entry here. So we're getting close to go time in the life and ministry of Jesus, of the big event in the ministry of Jesus, and that's the crucifixion and the death and the burial, right? So we're ramping up to that, and I think that's why Mark is making this resurrection type language in his account of this miracle of casting out this demon. All right, new stuff for today, verse 28. When he came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately. Why could we not drive out this demon that it's talking about? So the disciples have been rattled. Remember the picture of where we're coming from. The inner three, James, John, and Peter were up on the mountaintop. Couldn't remember the other 3. They were up on the mountaintop at the Transfiguration. They saw all this amazing stuff, and then they're coming back down the mountain, and we see the scenario where the other 9 couldn't heal or cast out this demon. And so they're saying, why can't we do that? And I think that's a key point in this issue is what they are failing to see is that that it's not their battle. Okay, it's not their battle at all. It's not the battle between them and the Pharisees. It's not the battle between them and the enemy, but in fact it's the battle between two kingdoms, an inferior kingdom of the enemy versus the overpowering kingdom of Jesus that he is establishing here. So they're saying, why can't we do it? And I think Jesus is going to kind of teach them through this and show them that it's not a we, it's a me, it's a Jesus thing. Okay. So Mark 9:29, it says, and he said to them, this kind cannot come about by anything but prayer. And so that's interesting when we see that. But Matthew, in the parallel passage over in his account of what's going on here, he says this, and he said to them, because of the littleness of your faith, for truly I say to you, if you have the faith of the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you. So Matthew seems to have another little angle on this, and I think it's interesting when we couple these two together, the element of prayer and the element of faith, what we see going on here. So remember, we've defined so far in our study in the book of Mark what faith is, how we're going to define it. And it's the acknowledgement, the submission, and the obedience to the power and the identity of Jesus. Okay, so prayer is not just an exchange of information. It's a way that and it's certainly not just a time for us to have a wish list to some sort of celestial Santa Claus, which oftentimes that's what we do. God, give me, give me, give me. That's what prayer is to us. And it's so much more, it's so much deeper. It is a reflection of our faith in him, acknowledgement, submission, obedience to Jesus' power and identity. And when we couple those two together, I think we get a good lesson on our prayer life. So prayer is about identifying who God is and who we are in light of who God is. So they ask, why couldn't we cast out the demon? And it's because they missed the point. The battle's between Christ's kingdom and the enemy. So we roll on through the text here through 30 and 31. It says, from there they went out and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. So note the consistency of this message. Whenever the Son of Man is used, this is in Mark's gospel account, he's pointing to the way the kingdom is established. So remember, Son of Man language, that brings us back to Daniel chapter 7. And it says this Son of Man will have a dominion that's an everlasting dominion. This Son of Man will have a kingdom that's an everlasting kingdom. And so Jesus is using that Son of Man language to talk about his everlasting kingdom, his everlasting dominion, and he's saying this is how it's established, through people killing me being betrayed, me being crucified, and me being raised 3 days later. That's the way the kingdom is established. Check out how this plays out in the Gospel of Mark. In 8:31, he says the Son of Man must suffer many things. In 9:9, he says until the Son of Man rose from the dead. 9:12, it says the Son of Man, that he will suffer many things and be treated with contempt. And now where we are here in 9:31. And then in 10:33, it says the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. The point of this Son of Man language in the book of Mark, the way Mark uses that phrase, is its kingdom, and this is the way the kingdom is established, through sacrifice of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. Huge theme in Mark, and we can't miss that. All right, 32. Despite the clarity and the consistency of Jesus' message of how his kingdom is established, check out where the mind of the disciples go. Verse 32. But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. They just totally missed it. They totally missed that he's saying how, he's giving them a clue of how the battle plan, I guess you'd say, of how the kingdom is established through his sacrifice and through his resurrection. And They say they don't understand, and they're afraid to ask him. Verse 33, it says, Then they came to Capernaum and went up to the house. He began to question them. What were you discussing along the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. All right, so first of all, a little bit of geography. Capernaum is kind of the home base territory for the gospel and for the ministry of Jesus. And so the house specifically here is very likely the one with the sunroof, right? The one that they had healed Jesus. They brought the paralytic to Jesus and dug a hole through the ceiling and dropped the man down. And he said, because of your faith. We talked about that a while back. So that's very likely the house that we're talking about. Hopefully they've fixed and repaired the sunroof in there by now. But Jesus, again, has dropped this huge principle of how the kingdom is established, yet they argue about, not only do they not understand, but they start arguing about who's the greatest in the kingdom. So how do you think that argument came about? It's kind of interesting when you think about where we've just been, and they've come down off the Mount of Transfiguration, and Peter, James, and John are probably saying, to the 9 that were left down, they see them arguing with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are saying, you can't heal them, and Peter, James, and John said, well, if we had been there, clearly we're the greatest in the kingdom, because we may or may not have seen some pretty big Old Testament celebrities up there, but we're not allowed to tell because Jesus told us not to tell. But we may or may not have seen some big time Old Testament celebrities. So clearly that makes us the biggest. And the guys down, the 9 left down on the ground with the Pharisees arguing with them, might have said, well, the reason is that you went up there is because he can't trust you to be alone. I mean, Peter, he calls you Satan. John, you're not getting the kingdom. He even in this chapter that we're in today, he's going to rebuke John and correct John today. So they're just bickering. This is human nature being played out. They're arguing over who's the greatest. So we see that being played out here. In 34 it says, but they kept silent. They knew they shouldn't be having this conversation. And that's kind of comical to me. They knew they shouldn't be doing it. When Jesus calls them out on it, they clam up, right? They get quiet. All right. So I want you to notice the conversation that we had in 8:34 and 35. I'll read that passage there. This is before the transfiguration, remember that. And he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. All right? So this is the same conversation. Listen what he reads now in this new text that we're discovering this morning. 9:35. Sitting down, they're arguing over who's the greatest. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, he's teaching them, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all the servants. What's Jesus doing? He's still continuing that same conversation he had before the transfiguration. And he's saying, don't you get it? Don't be arguing. Don't cause disunity in this kingdom that's being established by bickering over who's the greatest. He's saying, if you want to be first, you'll be last. If you want to be first, you'll be the servant to everyone. This is a paradigm shift from where they have been, because in their day, the people who are in authority positions expected to be served. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not the way my kingdom rolls. My kingdom rolls by serving. And he serves even to the point of death on the cross. He serves by coming down out of his seat that he deserves in heaven and comes and takes on stinky human flesh, right? And dwells among us and is betrayed and crucified, but ultimately is victorious in resurrection. And we get to experience that victory and that power of the resurrection in our lives now, because the Spirit that resurrected Jesus dwells within the hearts of believers. We've been promised that. And so we have that same power dwelling in us that enables us to have victory and power over sin and death in our lives. We can't miss that message. That's so crucial for the life of the believer. We don't have to succumb to sin that so easily entangles and ensnares us. We have victory through the cross, through the resurrection, through the power of the Holy Spirit. All right, so they don't get what he's saying here, and he gives them an object lesson. They're bickering over who's the greatest. He says, serve. That's how you become the greatest. And so he's like, let me give you an object lesson. Come here, little child. And that's where we're about to go in 36 and 37. Come here, little one. So he takes up a child and he sets him before them, and taking him in his arms, and he said to them, I kind of picture Jesus kind of roughing him up, giving him a little noogie, a little hug, a little bear hug. It says, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me does not receive me, but he who sent me. So what we have here is the establishment of a formula that works in the kingdom, how the kingdom works. You see, this is a vivid illustration for them, because he's saying whoever receives me, receives this little child, receives me, and if you're received by him, then you're received by the Father. So if you do it to the kid, you do it to me. If you do it to me, you do it to the Father. That's the equation. And this is way outside of our way of thinking, because kids were not valued in this time. They were kind of considered a nuisance to some degree. The only value that a kid would have really was if it was a male child, and that value was because it gave honor to the Father by perpetuating his name. So that was not the way it was. That's the way it was in the ancient world, not the way we're familiar with today, where we kind of have helicopter parents that hover over kids and every little thing that they do. That's not the way children were viewed during this time. So it's a little bit outside of our way of thinking. So Jesus is shifting a paradigm by bringing this child in as an emblem of the kingdom in some ways. Verse 38 says, John said to him, so Jesus is giving this teaching on how to be the greatest in the kingdom, like being this little kid. And John says, teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he was not following us. So first of all, here's another literary device that Mark seems to be using in his gospel account, is that anytime you see the word teacher being used, that's not a good thing. And so John calls Jesus his teacher. The three reasons that we see being played out and established of why someone uses teacher is they are either ignorant of the identity of Jesus, they either lack confidence in the identity of Jesus, or they're seditious. They're trying to undermine the identity of Jesus. So in this case, I think it's probably a lack of confidence in who Jesus is. And so this is another example of this inner three. John's part of the inner three, and he needs more help. This statement infers the 12 of the inner three are the greatest. Of the 12, the inner three are the greatest. And this guy certainly isn't great that's casting out these demons, so we need to put a kibosh on this. And Jesus says, no, you're not getting it. This is my kingdom is so much bigger than you inner three. My kingdom is so much bigger than you 12, and you got to get over this, okay? So Jesus gently corrects them as we go along through here, and he goes back and he gives a teaching point to John now, who's saying, we're better, we're part of the 12, and this guy doesn't need to be doing our job, casting out demons. That's our stuff. And here's how Jesus responds. But Jesus said, do not hinder him, for there is no one who will perform a miracle in my name and be able to soon afterwards to speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is for us. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because of your name as a follower of Christ, truly I say to you, he will not lose his reward. All right, so Jesus was establishing this principle back here with this child. If you receive this child, you do it to me. And if you do it to me, you do it to the Father. And so John kind of takes him off course and goes back to this disunity question again of this guy shouldn't be doing this. You want me to put a stop to this? And Jesus circled back around and says, for whoever gives a cup of cold water, whoever serves, follows me. And so here's that principle being restated by Jesus after John kind of takes him down a rabbit trail. But it's, if you do for and to a human, you do and for it to Jesus. If you do and for to Jesus, then you do and for to the Father. And that's the equation. That's the principle that's being established in 37 and now reiterated here in 39 through 41. So this is an upside down, fuzzy way of thinking. We talked about that two-phase healing, where the first time, he spits in his hand and he rubs the guy's eyes and he says, everything's fuzzy and upside down. He does, let's do it again. That's all this teaching element that Jesus is teaching, that the people and his disciples are seeing things fuzzy and upside down. They don't get his identity. And so we see that coming in again. Jesus is trying to give them clarity, and they're just missing it over and over again. They don't have eyes to see. They don't have ears to hear, right? Verse 42, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe to stumble, it would be better for them if they have a heavy millstone hung around their neck. He had been cast into the sea. So who are the little ones here? First of all, we're going to deal with that word stumble in just a moment, because it's another literary device that's tying this scenario in with the next topic that Jesus. So hang on to that word stumble. We'll get to it in just a moment. But here, let's deal with who the little ones are. Is it the children? Certainly he's probably still holding that little one in his arm, maybe still giving him a noogie there on the head. But is he just talking to that child? Probably yes. Is he talking to the disciples? I think yes, they're probably too as well. So what we see here is Jesus is serious about protecting his people. It's better for a millstone to be hung around somebody's neck if they cause them to stumble. So we're going to talk about that stumble in just a couple of slides here, but note the upcoming topic change here. We're going to shift from the topic of unity or disunity, as the case may be. They're quarreling over who would be the greatest. Now we're going to shift to a topic of purity. Let's take a look at it. 43 through 48 says, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life crippled than having your two hands to go into hell, into the unquenchable fire, where the worm does not die and the fire does not quench. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. If it's better for you to enter life lame than having your 2 feet to be cast into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire does not quench. If your eye causes you to stumble, throw it out. If it's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than having 2 to be cast into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. So is Jesus teaching self-mutilation here? Certainly not. This is a hyperbolic tool that Jesus is using to drive home the point of how important it is for us to be pure of heart. This is how serious it is for us as followers of Christ to submit to him as Lord and be obedient by following the precepts and principles that he lays out. We're to look different, church. We are to be distinctive in the way that we live our lives. We shouldn't be running around on our spouses. We shouldn't be cursing a blue streak. We shouldn't be watching the same stuff that the world watches. We are to be aliens. We are to be foreigners in this land. And how do we do that? How do we look different? Well, it's through obedience. It's through being submissive to what Jesus teaches through his word. So this matter of purity is important for the church. And I think that's why Jesus is working this in at this point. So he flows into this discussion of purity using the connecting word and language of stumble. I talked about that earlier. If you cause any of these little ones to stumble, there we see that word. And we see over and over through this passage in 43 through 48, if your hand causes you to stumble, right? See how he leads into that. So he's using that as a literary device to connect these two topics together. This unity and purity, all right, it causes stumble in the kingdom. So this word stumble comes from the root word of scandalizo, all right, and what the big idea in that word of stumble is to sin to apostasy. So apostasy is not just a oops, I sinned and now I'm outside of the grace of God. No, apostasy is an ongoing, intentional rebellion against Jesus, against his identity, against his kingdom. So that's what is being warned against here. If you cause someone to apostate, if you cause someone to stumble, one of these little children is better for a millstone. If your eye causes you to stumble, to go into apostasy, it's better for you to pluck out your eye, right? That's the idea. So what do we learn? Unity and purity is important in the kingdom. Verse 48. It says, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. That's a reference back to Isaiah 66, verse 24. If you have time, go back and read that passage in Isaiah 66, 22 through 24. But the big idea in that is it gives a picture of hope, but it also gives a picture of judgment. So if you are unified and if you have purity, then the kingdom is going to grow, right? If you don't, you're going to have a millstone hung around your neck. If you don't seek unity and seek purity, then you're going to be eaten up in a place where worms don't die and the fire's not quenched. You see that clash of hope and judgment in the language that Jesus is pulling out by using that in his teaching here. So 49 and 50, it says, for everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if the salt becomes unsalty, with what will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. So here he's circling back to this idea of unity. Be at peace with one another. They're bickering, they're quarreling against each other, and he's bringing it back to this big idea of this passage of unity. So let's talk about salt. When we think about salt, we think about, I want to add some salt to my French fries because they don't have enough flavor, right? And that's what we think about in our historical context today and where we are is flavor. And a lot of people take this to say that Christians are the spice of life. I don't think that's where we're getting at here. One idea that's we kind of are familiar with, but it's not as common as it was back then because we have refrigerators today. But back then, if they preserved meats, they would preserve it with salt. I love me some salt cured ham and biscuits and honey. Man, that's good stuff. So we kind of are familiar with that because of that good food of salt cured ham. And that certainly may be a component of what's being talked about here. Christians are to preserve in our culture and our society today. We are that preservative nature. But there may be something else going on here, something that we don't think about, but a guy named E.P. Dietrich, he's an agricultural engineer, says that in their geographical area of the Dead Sea, that salt in that time was different than the salt like we have. We have salt, table salt is sodium chloride is what it is. But the salt in the Dead Sea region would have been like potash, phosphate, or ammonium. Now, if you ever put out triple 13 in the spring to make your yard green up, you know ammonium is that agent that causes that green to come about. It's a fertilizer. And so I think this is probably more along the lines of what he's talking about. Luke makes reference to it in Luke 14. Therefore, salt is good, but even if salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless, either for the soil or for manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears, let him hear. There's that covenant language again. It's that warning again, right? Don't become useless salt. Be a preservative agent. Be a fertilizing agent, a fertilizer of the gospel that brings growth So that's a big idea of what's going on in this passage here. So wrapping it up today, we have a big discussion on unity or disunity. Jesus was teaching them about that. They're arguing over who's the greatest, and he circles that back into unity. We also have a big idea of purity that's being talked about today. So what do we say? If you want to stifle kingdom growth and end up with a millstone around your neck or in a place where the fire is unquenchable, go ahead and bicker and quarrel and fight among yourselves, and don't worry about your personal purity. All these things stifle kingdom growth. Now, if you want to be a growth agent of the kingdom, be salt. Seek purity, seek unity, seek the good of others above self. That propels the kingdom. That grows the kingdom. So that's the charge for today as we head out and you go out about your way, is to live this out today. Be one who seeks unity and one who seeks to serve, because that's the way the kingdom is established. Go out and have a good one.